second part of our three-part series on Cassandra Speaks. Tonight, this one right here. Tonight we are talking about Pandora, which is very, very, very exciting stuff.
So exciting.
So exciting. I am Randall. With us again is Deb. Deb, you want to do a little mini intro for our new friend?
I'm Deb Maroulis. If you haven't met me before, no, I'm kidding. I'm a junior college professor. I teach mythology and English. I am a PhD candidate in mythological studies, and I write YA novels.
Woo! And we did have a question last week about what YA meant, and I thought that was a great question because that's not necessarily something like a term that everyone's familiar with. So sure. I answered the question really straightforward, but would you like to expand on it?
It's books that fall under the genre of young adult, and some people, if they're hearing me say YA young adult is a genre, they're cringing. Other people are like, yes, it's a genre, finally. There's a whole discussion. If you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of it, go on Twitter, and if you still have skin when you leave, you'll know. But they're they're just novels that are geared towards teenagers. There's middle grade novels too, which are like, 5th through 8th grade. Readers usually read up, so we usually get 8th grade through college. And I know a lot of adults read YA, especially fantasy. I write contemporary novels. I like to take myths and turn them into contemporary stories, and sort of rewrite the girl side of it to make them more badass than they typically show up in myth. So hopefully I'll have news on some books soon. I know.
What spoke to you about the book?
Just a little, I think. Maybe it was just like my soul was speaking to me. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So some examples of YA literature that have like hit the big time could be like Hunger Games, or Twilight.
Yes. Huge.
I'm just trying to think of things that.
Yeah, no, you're right. Those are the big ones. Hunger Games was big. Of course, the rules have changed so fast, and the market became so flooded after those came out that now it's all different. It all works differently. It's hard to keep up with actually don't keep up with trends. It's just, unless you're a reader, keep up with trends. But if you're trying to write YA, don't keep up. Just write what you want to write, because by the time you get your book finished, the trend will be gone.
Perfect. Great advice.
Yes.
Great advice from a fancy professional.
Fancy. By the way, I think I'm gonna have to switch chairs next time we're together, because my nervous energy, I twist in my chair a lot.
But it makes your sleeve look great.
Oh, good. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Well, that's something. All right.
Denise said hi. Hi, Denise. Hi. So let's get down to business. Sorry, I was talking about Donny Osmond today, so I just can't.
Well, he did have a pretty cool coat. Okay.
He had a great coat, and we'll have to discuss that at a later date. It was an amazing
coat. Technicolor even, I think. Dreamy. Okay, I'll stop.
We started on listing the colors of that coat. We got to get into this.
Yes.
Okay. Big Donny Osmond fan over here.
Yeah, I had the Barbies, the Donny and Marie Barbies with the stage and everything growing up. I still have my original album. I'll give it to you if you want it.
I would love it.
I will give it to you. I have Captain and Tennille too, if you want that. I know.
Amazing. Okay, so before we went off on a Donny Osmond tangent, let's get down to the
business one does
of this meeting.
Okay. Can I just say something? The curve this week on Pandora made me feel like what you said earlier, I didn't know anything about mythology. Oh my God.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know us, Deb and I both have master's degrees in mythological studies as our second master's. Is your first master's in English?
English with an emphasis in film as literature.
Okay.
Fancier.
My first master's degree is basically in English. It's technically liberal arts and sciences with a focus in English. So we thought we knew what we were talking about. We're both professors of mythology. We both thought we knew the story of Pandora. And unfortunately, Elizabeth Lesser only focuses, what is it, like 7 or 8 pages on Pandora in this book, but it really sets the stage and the tone for the rest of her exploration.
I think it's important too to acknowledge that it's a great connection between Eve, who she starts with, and then Cassandra, where she goes, right? So Pandora's a good connector. Anyway, you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I knew the story of Pandora. I didn't realize how many parallels it had to the story of Eve. I didn't realize like her origin story. I had no idea that she was created in response to Prometheus stealing fire. I thought those were just separate stories of Greek mythology. And I think it's necessary to mention that well, Deb, you kind of are, but I'm not an expert on Greek mythology. This isn't my specific area of study or area of expertise. And when talking about mythological studies as a field of study, it can be really, I think it could be confusing for people, because a lot of people, when they hear mythology, they specifically think of Greek and Roman mythology. And the reality is, our PhD program, it's an overview, it's breadth, not necessarily depth, as a lot of programs are. And
it's up to us to go in the depths if we want to, right?
Yeah. So we have, even though our emphasis is depth psychology, the reality is we took 2 semesters on Greek and Roman myth.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like a Greek and Roman intro class. Here's a family tree of all the gods and goddesses, and here's how they're connected, right? Which would have been helpful, but that's something we kind of did on our own to provide us context. It was really, what we study is more how these myths affected society then and affect society today. And
our psyches, right? The depth psychology part, how those myths represent the things that happen to us as people as we mature and go through life and experience life.
Right. And that's why stories like Pandora's are so important still. And I feel like I go into this tangent almost every time we go live, but mythology is living and breathing, and it forms the basis for how we understand the world around us and our place within it. And so we could say that this is just a fanciful tale that people in ancient Greece used to tell each other. But the reality is, if you say the word Pandora to somebody, people immediately know who you're talking about. Still, thousands of years later. Sure, they might relate it to the music streaming platform or the jewelry platform, but guess what? They're both freaking named after this Pandora. So I think that's really, really nice and fun, right? Pandora, as we know, her name, Pan, means all, and Dora means gift. And so I've heard different translations of her name.
There's 2, yeah. Yeah, and it depends on which academic source you're using, but you could argue that it could be both. Right. Can I back up a little bit on the
and the gift? Interesting.
Yeah. I want to talk about a little bit of when we mention Pandora, the next what image pops up for people. Like, we all say, yes, it's hugely visible. We all recognize who Pandora is and what her story is. But what image is conjured from most people? And that's her opening a box. Right? Yeah. And
but was it a box?
It was not. It was a jar. Yes. The original Greek that Hesiod, just kidding. What
all the ways are right and all the ways are wrong.
Exactly.
It's Hesiod, it's
yes.
We're not guess what? So we can kind of say it how we want. Oh, hi, Kim.
So yeah, and so the original word was pithos, which is which is jar in Greek. I know, hello. And it was Erasmus later on that mistranslated it and turned it into is it Pixos? It's something, I'll look, actually I have it right here. I'll look it up in a second. But so that was like something that just caught on, and it became a box. And what's interesting though is if you look at the stories closely, the focus of the stories, or even all the art later on in the Renaissance, when this was all rediscovered and people were relearning the myths and stories for the Renaissance time, the era, none of those pictures or art focused on her opening the jar or the box. It was all on the gods building her. And that really shifts the story. And my one criticism of this book, which I know this is me being weird because I love this book so much, is that she likes the idea of who tells the tales, and she wants to continue Pandora's story after she opens the jar. And we can tell the story in a second. But I kind of disagree with her. I don't think that's where the focus of her story should be. I think it should be on the gods creating her and what that means for society.
When I picture the gods when I creating her, I think of the scene from Disney's Sleeping Beauty when the fairies are coming, they're like giving her the gifts.
Mm-hmm.
That feels just like a direct
I read that somewhere.
thing of the Pandora story, that all the gods and goddesses are around this creation of clay, giving her their gifts that they are known for.
Yeah. Yeah, I read that in one, I think it was either Natalie Haynes' books or the Eve book. I don't remember where.
No original ideas.
That is original. Well, I mean, it came to you originally, organically. But yeah, that's interesting. So do you want to tell her story? You want to tell just a brief one?
A brief
one. Do it. Yeah.
All right. So Prometheus, as we know, stole fire and brought it to the humans. And Zeus was pissed about this, furious. And so he decided, of course, he punished Prometheus, right, by chaining him to the mountain. It was a mountain. Chaining him to the mountain and having an eagle peck out his liver every day. And every night his liver would regenerate to allow for more pecking the next day. But what I didn't realize about the story is that Prometheus's brother, Epimetheus, struggling with that, y'all. Epimetheus was also involved in this plot to steal the fire from the gods and bring it to the humans. And so and we'll have to talk about the Prometheus story as well, because I didn't realize it's like a Cain and Abel type situation with those brothers. A whole other conversation. So Epimetheus basically goes and hides in the woods and hopes that he doesn't get discovered and he doesn't get punished by the gods the way Prometheus does. He goes to visit Prometheus, and Prometheus is like, bro, get the F out of here. I'm glad you feel sorry for me, and I'm glad you want to visit me, but this will be your fate if you get caught as well. So that was a pretty solid.
And BT dubs, don't take any gifts from Zeus. Just saying. Yeah.
Don't take gifts from Zeus. And depending on the version of the story, Prometheus says this or Hermes says this, but it's a big blatant warning that if Zeus offers you a gift, it is a curse. Don't do it. And so Epimetheus is like, okay, cool. Like that should be pretty easy. Spoiler alert.
But think about too, tell everyone what their names mean and why this makes sense that Epimetheus would be the one that gets trapped. Prometheus means forerunner, right? Or forethought. Epimetheus means afterthought. So he's just kind of like, oh yeah, consequences. That's where I live. So
yeah, this is something that's so interesting that we miss as modern non-Greek looking at these stories. We don't understand what their names mean. So we've got forethought, afterthought, and all of the gifts Pandora comes to us.
Yeah,
interesting.
I love it.
So Epimetheus is just like chilling in the forest, being a hermit, and Zeus finds him, and Zeus is like, we're going to make that mofo pay. And not only are we going to make him pay, we're going to make all of humanity pay, because humanity is terrible. basically, before Prometheus stole fire, the idea was that, here's a parallel with Eve, the idea was that humanity was just living on Earth in this kind of Garden of Eden-esque existence. Depending on the version of the story, it was an all-male Earth, or it was a mixed male and female Earth. The version I like, it was a mixed male and female Earth, because Pandora comes. Anyways, we'll get to that. So Zeus is like, we're going to make them pay. And the gods are like, why do you want to make them pay? Why don't you just like shake your Etch-a-Sketch, destroy this planet, and just start over again? We don't need these humans. We'll just make a new batch of them. And Zeus is like, nope, I'm not dealing with that. Spoiler alert, they do it later. Anyways. So he decides to create a woman from clay. And he has Hephaestus create her, build her from clay, create a woman, and then all the gods and goddesses get together and give their gifts to this proto-woman. You can call it what was it? Woman?
Mm-hmm. You are.
Yeah, the first woman. So they give her all these wonderful gifts, right? Like Athena gives her wisdom, and Aphrodite gives her beauty. And they make her like real sassy. They make sure that she has
Hermes. Hermes the trickster gives her all of that. Yeah.
Of course he does.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And curiosity.
And the Graces come and they bestow charms upon her, which I thought was really interesting, because the Graces are goddesses of charm, beauty, and fertility, but the specific charms they give Pandora are jewelry and gold. Interesting. So Pandora like comes to life and impresses all the gods and goddesses with how beautiful she is and how wise and how knowledgeable and how wonderful. But she's really saucy, even though, Hermes gave her the sass, but Zeus is like, this chick is pretty mouthy and don't love that, but whatever. Time to go. So Zeus brings her down to Epimetheus's home in the forest, and Epimetheus opens the door and he's like, there's Zeus. And Zeus is like, hey, I have a favor to ask of you. Some versions it's a favor. The version I like, it's a reward. He says, hey, I feel really bad about what I did to Prometheus, and it wasn't cool of me, so I want to apologize. And Epimetheus is like, great, so you're going to let him go? And Zeus is like, no, I'm going to let him continue to get his liver pecked out continuously for all eternity. But to show how sorry I am, look, I brought you this perfect, wonderful, beautiful wife. And this is why I think that the world existed with women in it, because Epimetheus was like, wow, I don't know if I'm deserving of such a wonderful, beautiful wife. Right? So he knew what a wife was. He knew what the concept of marriage was, and he knew how he was supposed to behave within the context of marriage. And Zeus was like, no, you deserve it. You deserve it. I treated your brother horribly. You deserve it. So Zeus like steps aside to reveal Pandora, and she has beautiful flowing hair and beautiful pale translucent skin and sparkling eyes. And the version I read, she has brown eyes, brown sparkling eyes. They specifically made sure to mention. And her dress was created from sunlight and moonlight and the light of 1,000 stars. So that makes me think of Little Mermaid when she comes out of the water in her sexy glittering dress that's basically made of ocean water. It's like that, but out.
I was thinking what I wore to my senior prom, but sure, that's fine.
Pandora is just incredibly gorgeous and beautiful, and Epimetheus is like, I don't trust you and your gifts. And Zeus is kind of like, but this isn't just one gift. This is Pandora. This is all of the gifts just for you. And Epimetheus is like, well, you're beautiful, and I could never, never snag someone as great as you. So maybe I'll just watch my back and things will be okay. And then Zeus presents them with a wedding gift. because of course it's like a shotgun wedding. Zeus is like, okay, you're going to marry her? Great. Let's put it together right now. So they
Boom,
get
they're married.
Yeah, the gods and goddesses bless their wedding, and Zeus presents them with a jar. And Pandora's like, ooh, this jar's fancy. What am I going to put in it? What am I going to do with it? And Zeus is like, nope, that's a jar for looking only, not for touching. That's a decorative jar. Don't you dare open it. But of course, one of the gifts that Pandora was bestowed with was curiosity. So Epimetheus is like, the jar is the gift that we need to be suspicious of. Don't ever touch that jar. And he takes it and he hides it in the attic. But then, of course, Pandora, oh, and thank you. I feel like I'm rambling with this story, but I appreciate it.
No, you're doing great.
So the jar's in the attic. And of course, like Sleeping Beauty, Pandora finds herself up in the attic looking for something. And she hears whispers. And she's like, something's calling me. And depending on the version of the story, I've read that it's like legitimate whispers talking to her, a voice, and other stories it's like she's just drawn to the jar, like some sort of magnetism. But in this version, she hears the jar speaking to her, and the jar's like, hey, Pandora, it won't hurt. Just check me out. Just check me out. You know you want to. And she's like, I definitely want to. And she holds the jar, and there's such anticipation. And then Epimetheus is like, woman, what are you doing? This is like literally the only thing you were told not to do. Of course, right? Don't press the red button. And then that's the only thing you want to do. So Epimetheus takes it and hides it again. And Pandora's like, okay. But she could still hear it talking to her. And it tells her, don't listen to your husband. Don't do what he says. You and me, we got a connection here. You know you want it. You know you want to see what's inside. Everything that you could ever wish for and imagine is inside. All you got to do is open that lid. And Pandora's like, this is sounding more and more legit. But then she thinks like, well, you know, I have only been alive for a few days, so I don't know a lot. And I was told not to open this by Zeus and by my husband, but this jar is telling me another story. But at this point, Epimetheus is getting really, really irritated with Pandora because she's like a literal toddler. Why do the waves crash on the shore? Why is the sky blue? Why are there clouds? Right? Reading the story literally made me feel like I was sitting and talking to my 2-year-old. And so Epimetheus is like over it. So he stops watching her as closely as he perhaps should be. And she's like, hey man, I'm going to go take a walk. Like, nah, it's going to be an independent walk just for me. I'm just going to like go down to the river.
Definitely not going to the attic.
Well, but Epimetheus rehid the jar, and this mofo rehid it like by a tree, and it's calling to her so loudly, like the telltale heart. Boom, 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 boom.
There you go.
And she finds it, and she picks it up, and she starts trying to open the lid, but it's a little difficult. And she opens it, and Epimetheus sees her, and he's like, no! But everything rushes out of the jar. Every plague and pestilence and evil and every bad thing Zeus could think of, and Zeus is an imaginative one. They all fly out of the jar and can never be recovered. And Epimetheus and Pandora are trying to like force the lid back in the jar. Like drop dead Fred.
Why? Oh, okay.
Just pushing us back in this box. You haven't seen Drop Dead Fred, please go watch it. The gem.
It is something, yeah.
They can't. They tried to catch everything as it flew away, but it was released forever. gone, unleashed on an unsuspecting human world. But wait, one little firefly got caught under the lip of the jar. And would you like to give us the Greek word for that?
Elpis.
Help us. It was hope. Hope stayed behind. Hope springs eternal, something like that. Hope stayed behind, and now that is why we have suffering, we have disease, we have all of these things that are out of our control, but we still are able to hold on to hope through it all. The end. Thank you. Thank you.
Good job. You're hired for telling the stories. I don't have to do it anymore.
Oh, geez.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna admit, right before we sat down to do this, I was with my friends and I did a tasting flight of 7% kombucha. So
We'll do that again. So,
so that was very fun. So I'm sure I left out some parts, or
and
oral mythology.
Yeah,
It changed.
I love that you bring that up, because and you kept saying depending on which version, and it really does depend, because in some versions Zeus gave them a gift of all kinds of happy things going in the jar. Sometimes it was Epimetheus that opened the jar and not Pandora. So again, it just depends.
Yeah.
I did read earlier.
Commented on our YouTube stream the modernized retelling of the story. Thank you, Devin.
Yes, very nice. The word Elpis doesn't translate super closely into hope, which I thought was interesting. It's something I learned today. It really comes out more as anticipation or expectation.
Interesting.
Isn't that interesting? So if you're thinking about what's left, how does expectation translate into hope? That's my question.
Well, Dr. Frankenfurter would have something to say about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he sees you shiver.
He does. He does do that. Yes.
Patience.
Well, the thing is, in the ancient Greek mind, hope wasn't necessarily always positive. It was an expectation. So,
and that's a really interesting thing, because I have here in my notes, hope seems foolish to hold on to when all of the evils are outside, unleashed on the world. Didn't seem like a nice, beautiful, hopeful ending to me. That seemed foolish and empty. Like, just because you have a scrap of hope left doesn't mean that it doesn't negate all of that madness and chaos that was just unleashed on the world. And it seemed like such a naive takeaway, a naive moral story for Pandora to be like, well, there's hope left, right? And of course, she's only a few days old. She literally has the personality of a toddler. She is a child. She is a child in a woman's body. And I think this brings up an interesting question about the creation of humanity, because Adam and Eve were also created as adults, but they had the minds of children.
yes.
And here we have Pandora created as an adult, but in a world with, and let's point out, I forgot to mention that Epimetheus, he's a Titan. He is immortal. He is presumably hundreds, if not thousands of years old at this point. We don't know.
He's Bella and Edward.
I know. And there's this interesting book. It's a modernized, flipped retelling of the Frankenstein myth. Not Rocky Horror Picture Show, which also is a retelling of Frankenstein, but I'll stop with the Rocky.
So Drop Dead Fred, Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Donny Osmond.
Keeping that mythology fresh.
It is fresh.
It is fresh. You're right.
I'm not going to argue that Donny Osmond's fresh, but so there's a modernized retelling of Frankenstein. It's called Poor Things, and it's been several years since I've read this, so the details are a little fuzzy, but essentially it's an older man creating the perfect woman to be his companion. And then she goes from like, she's created as an adult woman, but she has the mind of a child, and she's naive and she depends on her creator for everything, but then they end up falling in love. And it brings up all of these questions. Where is maturity? Just because somebody has the appearance of a fully adult, fully biological adult, does this mean that the state of their mind doesn't matter? Because that's what a lot of these stories are telling us. That's what I got from Adam and Eve, or I'm sorry, from Pandora, from the Pandora story, that she's a literal child in a woman's body, given as a gift against her will to marriage to an immortal. And I know that in Greek mythology, it's full of immortals and mortals having dalliances, if you want to call them that. As we've said before, Zeus is usually raping everybody all the time. But it's clear that immortals in this mythology, immortals can't have sex with humans. But I don't know. It skeeves me out. It grosses me out. And I know I'm applying a modern lens to an ancient text, and that's not
Well,
always
I think if we're looking at Hesiod's version, his reads like an angry man. His reads like he's pissed at his brother and he's pissed at his wife, or maybe some woman who rejected him, and he wrote this because he pulled from earlier texts that have none of this anger, none of this shitting on women, excuse my language, that he brings to it. Say it again.
But some people like that. No kink shaming here.
You know, whatever. Yeah, that's fine.
His angry misogynist viewpoint, and that's the version that we remember. And according to like earlier frescoes and depictions of this myth, Pandora, like, she was seen as somebody who did bring all of the gifts, and perhaps those were good and bad gifts at the same time.
Yes, that's exactly right.
There's a lot of morals, a lot of stories that bring us the moral that like you can't appreciate good without the bad. You can't have sunny days without the rain, or you can't have a rainbow without the rainstorm, right? Like, we hear this over and over again, but somehow Pandora is irresponsible and blamed when she was literally created specifically to do this. Why aren't we pissed at Zeus, y'all?
Thank you. Let me read this real quick, because that's where I kick in on who's to blame, on who gets a pass, just like with the Adam and Eve story, right? But Polly Young Eisendrath, who Elizabeth Lesser uses a quote for at the beginning of her Pandora chapter, says, "Both Eve and Pandora bring death into the world. This is a curious reversal of the fact that women bring life into the world, but it says something about the meaning of woman within a religion dominated by male gods." But I think I could take that further and say women do bring death into the world because we bring life into the world. That there is no womb without the tomb, if you will, right? Life and death go together. And if you bring life into something, that ultimately means it's going to die.
I mean, Mufasa said it best, right?
Who did?
Mufasa.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right? The lions eat the antelopes, and the antelopes eat the grass, and the lions become the grass when they die as food for the antelopes. And it's the circle. Like, we all, everything in this life, like, it's all a symbiotic relationship. And if we didn't have death, life would be meaningless. Just like if we didn't have bad, we wouldn't know how to appreciate the good. We would just kind of like be there. And shout out for the sitcom The Good Place. If you haven't watched that, I think it's all available on Netflix. They really explore this concept in a really, really interesting way. I mean, and this is a huge philosophical argument. Like, can you know happiness without sadness?
Yeah. But I do think that that's why, without the misogynistic lens, and once we get Hesiod's story and then Erasmus's later, and then Aesop's fable even brings it in, writes about Pandora, and then children's books, and they, every time that story is oversimplified, Pandora's nuances go away, right? I think it would be a really interesting look, an idea, and there probably is research on this, is to take a look at that story of the creation of Pandora with the jewels and all of those things through an alchemical lens, to see what sort of creation stories happening there. Because you mentioned gold, right? Why would they choose to give her gold if that's the ultimate life source, right? And that like with the philosopher's stone, etc., that might be, that is her all gift, right? She brings in eternal life, even though life can't be eternal. Life is eternal through a chain, but not through one singular experience.
Right. Well, the version I read specifically mentioned that they gave her golden chains.
Yeah.
Very
Which
interesting.
is interesting.
Her from Charles. I only knew Pandora was something that brought great destruction. I didn't know it was Zeus's idea. Like, and I think that sums it all up, right?
Yep.
This is freaking victim blaming.
Yeah.
Pandora was created for this purpose. I mean, okay, I have a note here that I wrote. Eve was tempted, but Pandora was specifically created to open the jar. But isn't God omnipotent? And this is a question that Anne asked last time. Doesn't God know all that's going to happen? And this is a huge theological and philosophical debate. If there is a God or gods or goddesses and they are omnipotent, what's up with that? We have free will. And so a popular theory is that God knows what's in your, or the Christian God, if that's who we're talking about.
There you go.
Christian God knows what's in your heart, knows what you're going to do, but you have the free will to make those choices. And all he can do is sit and watch you make those choices, wishing that maybe he could encourage you to go in a different direction.
I swear to God, that story was written for people who parent teenagers. Just you wait.
Eve was tempted, and depending on the version of the story of Pandora you're reading, sure, she was tempted by this like anthropomorphized jar.
Mm-hmm.
But the temptation was there because she's a child. She's a literal child.
Can we talk about the jar itself?
Yeah.
So that type of jar, the Pithos jar, was used to store grains or wine, right? Which are both things that are attributed to goddess, right? The great goddess, the like Demeter, Isis, right? All of these Hathor, these goddesses that provided the ways for humanity to survive. Or
they were.
I missed what you said.
Placenta feeding humanity.
Oh yeah. And this jar was also used for funeral rites. So again, we have that birth and death symbol within the jar, and that it's given to her is shown that this is something that it's her gift to give to humanity when she opens it, but that ability is given to her by the gods. Now we get this misogynistic lens that tells us that's a bad thing because, oh no, in ancient Greece, even before it was Greece, right, when you had city-states or whatever, depending, would you say ancient Greece for simplicity's sake, women were not allowed to be citizens, right? Women were not allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to really be out in public. They weren't allowed to speak to any man unless they were like super close to them. In fact, the best way a woman could exist in ancient Greece was to almost have zero footprint, right? To use today's terms. And here comes a woman who asks questions and who is curious and who talks back and won't give up and wants to know all the answers. Of course that woman is going to be seen as bad, right? I I just picture Hesiod coming home after like a really bad date and just pissed off because he yeah, what a bitch, and just like starts, well, probably writing.
Do we know how old Hesiod was when he wrote these works? Because this sounds a lot like when I was in high school and I'd come home and like write an angsty song.
Oh yeah. See, I wrote poetry. It was so bad.
I mean,
I only know that he existed around the time Homer supposedly existed. I don't know how old he was.
right. And I mean,
But
I'm sure
yeah.
nobody knows how old he was, but I don't know, y'all. I've seen 55-year-old men act like 13-year-olds. So what are you gonna do?
Yeah, seriously.
So
Go on TikTok.
Kim commented that Pandora was the vessel, which is a great segue because we totally agree. Deb and I were talking about that.
Oh,
earlier.
yes. I was just looking at the quote.
Yeah, and here on page 40 of Cassandra Speaks, Elizabeth Lesser says that earlier versions of the spoken myth that are pieced together from the artwork on 5th century BCE pottery paint Pandora as an embodiment of the fertility of the earth, a healer and a life giver, right? And if we think about other traditions, for example, the Hindu tradition with the goddess Kali, right? The creator and the destroyer, like you can't have one without the other. And having both the power to create and the power to destroy embodied in one individual or one representation, I mean, makes a lot of sense.
I mean, that's why Demeter gives birth to Persephone, who becomes the queen of the underworld. You have to have both in some sort of relationship, right? And they're forever intertwined in their reuniting every year, right? I mean, that's just something that has to happen. These stories aren't just stories about people, they're stories about how the world exists, and more importantly, how we interpret that world we exist in, right? And then when we break it down into these lenses, it gets ugly, right? I mean, even thinking of the word box, like what happened to the myth when jar turned into a box? And the church gets a hold of these stories, and then box becomes a metaphor for vagina, and then it becomes evil, right? And then Pandora herself becomes the embodiment of evil, just like Eve became the embodiment of evil, even though she was in the story the vehicle for the evil, or what people called evil.
And I feel like this jar, like Schrodinger's cat situation.
Thank you. Yes.
Everything simultaneously exists and doesn't exist in this jar until she opens it. And it's the same with the womb. It's the same with femininity, same with creation and destruction of life, right? Like it's so interesting. Now there was I need to find it because I listened to this part. Here we go. This is from the book of Sirach, from the chapter of Father's Care for His Daughter, and it's on pages 44 to 45 if you have your Cassandra Speaks with you. Keep strict watch over a headstrong daughter, or else when she finds liberty, she will make use of it. As a thirsty traveler opens his mouth and drinks from any water near him, so she will sit in front of every tent peg and open her quiver to the arrow. So I love the use of the word thirsty to describe horniness, right? Everything new is old.
Yep.
And so it's just this, and this is from a Hebrew scholar around 200 BCE. So this is after.
Yes, that's after, because Hesiod was about 8th century. So
yeah, this is so around 200 years before Jesus, for context. So just
it's
like
interesting.
Cultural mores and ideas, like they run so deep, right? Here we are discussing texts from literal thousands of years ago that are still influencing the way that our culture exists today.
Well, think about
in different languages, and it's still so influential. Sorry, Deb.
No, it's okay. Hesiod describes her, he uses the Greek words kalon kakon, which means a beautiful evil, right? Or you could call it a pretty bane, but they're both adjectives. So why what would have happened to the story, or what would have happened to the female blame if we switched those? What if we said kakon kalon and we made it an evil beautiful? How does that change the story? What are the implications of that? It's just interesting. And also getting back to Elizabeth Lesser's, one of her first points she makes, I think it's in the introduction, where she says, who is telling the story, right? We were talking about all the gods who have the agency over what happened to Pandora, how they built her, why they built her. And then, but also who is interpreting the story? What kind of mood were they in? What sort of language, who did they learn their Greek from?
What was going on at home at the time?
Yeah. I know, like, if we've ever graded essays, and, I've had to put essays down when I'm in a bad mood because it's not fair to take it out on the students. So I'm just like, okay, I'm just going to take a little break because they don't deserve that. And I am being
with your partner and then sit down to grade essays. Whew.
No, don't do that. Don't do that. Yeah. So it's like that scene in Bad Teacher when she's grading the To Kill a Mockingbird essays. She's like, are you fucking kidding me? And then she just crosses out the F word. It's my favorite. But no, I think that's important. Do you want to touch on at all the children of Prometheus and Pandora? Do you want to go there?
There's a full own episode.
Yeah.
But quick and dirty summary is that the daughter of Pandora and the son of Prometheus, yes, they're cousins, y'all, but this is mythology.
Most parents are brothers and sisters.
Yeah, the gods and goddesses are brothers and sisters. It's just like a whole orgy fest. There's not a lot of judgment happening. Like, everybody just kind of does what they want. And this is true across mythology.
All mythologies, yeah.
Creations of just limited people, like y'all, if Adam and Eve were the only people on Earth and then they had a kid, like, how did more kids come to populate the Earth?
Soup's awkward.
Yeah, roll on. So Pandora's daughter and Prometheus's son get together, and this time the gods are finally like, screw humanity. We're done with these fools. They're ridiculous. They're not living up to our expectations. We're done. Let's get rid of them. And so then, and do you know who it was who tipped our couple off? Was it Hermes?
Yes, it was. Of course, the messenger god. Yes,
the messenger god, always spicing things up.
It's
so he goes and warns them, like, hey, y'all, floods a coming. Here's exactly what to build, how to build it. Y'all know this story, right? Tale as old as time.
Yeah.
40 cubits, is it?
Yep.
I'm sorry, I'm a little rusty on my cubits.
That's weird.
Sorry. Tell them exactly how to build it, how big to build it, and how to survive this storm. And guess what happens? Storm comes, floods everywhere, and they end up washed up on a mountaintop after the waters recede. So
Parnassus. Mm-hmm.
Get the idea that even though Pandora wasn't the first person or the first woman created, she is the mother of all, because it is her daughter who repopulated the earth after the
Pyrrha. Yeah.
So we have Pyrrha and Prometheus' son.
It's hang on, I always have to look at it to be able to pronounce it because I know that I'm going to get it wrong. It's Deucalion. Deucalion and Pyrrha. Dang it! I want to have another kid named Deucalion.
Oh, that's what I was thinking.
Great name. Okay, Matthew, you're changing your name.
Matthew, are you watching this?
He's working. He's pouring drinks right now.
So they repopulate the earth. So we
But
have.
tell them how they repopulate the earth.
Okay, so they're on the mountain. Oh, I don't have any props around here.
Well, I hope not.
I do.
Oh my gosh, you sure do. Okay.
Wait, and I've got. Oh. This'll do.
Oh no. Oh well, yeah, that works. You're fancy. Yep.
Synchronicity. So they read or they hear. When I'm a little fuzzy on these details.
They're told to turn around, right? And
Turn
throw
around
rocks.
and get like the bones of the mother, to throw the bones of their mother
Yes.
behind them. And they realize, oh, you're speaking in riddles, right? Because spoiler alert, most of ancient religious stories are spoken in riddles. Jesus spoke in allegories, stories were told in allegories. Like, this is very, very common. So taking things literally is a little not ideal, because, right, if they heard this, like, take the bones of your mother and throw them over your shoulder, like, what the hell does that mean?
They'd be like, but our moms are dead. They're lost in the flood. Like, we don't have them. Guess we're gonna die.
Can't find any bones around here. And they realize, no, it's Mother Earth, y'all.
Mother Earth, y'all.
Picking up rocks, throwing them behind them, picking up sticks, throwing them behind them. And every rock that Pyrrha threw became a woman.
A woman.
And every rock, or every stick, pretty phallic, is it?
Yeah, I just thought of that. I didn't realize that.
Alien
Okay,
throws,
alien.
get it, turns into a man. But this is really interesting too, because if Hermes is involved in this, like, Hermes is gender fluid, for those who don't know.
Yes.
So this leaves a question that I don't have an answer to, but hopefully maybe I will next week. What does this mean if there are only sticks and rocks thrown being made into the two sexes? I mean, there are a lot of other bones of the mother. There are twigs, there are pebbles, there are, I mean, I guess arguably those are just different kinds of sticks and rocks, but there are dirt, there's plant matter, there's all sorts of stuff, you know? So
Water.
who knows? Water,
Yeah.
salt, minerals. I mean, shoot, look at this rock. This isn't just one thing, right? There's a lot going on here, a lot of complexity. So there's different kinds of rocks and sticks that they threw behind them. That's beautiful.
It is.
So that was how they repopulated the earth, which is interesting because then it kind of gets around that really awkward incest thing.
Oh yeah, that's true. One of the only mythologies that does that.
Yeah. So yeah, let us know. Did y'all know that there was a flood myth in ancient Greek mythology that has so many parallels to the flood story from Hebrew mythology that a lot of us know, right? The Lord said to Noah, there's going to be a floody, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Children out of the muddy children of the Lord. So,
well, I'm 12 in summer camp. For you. He's got you.
So we have, yeah, and I'm gonna be honest, I didn't know until today that the flood story was part of ancient Greek mythology. I knew the populating the earth with the rocks and the sticks, turning them into people, but I had no idea that came after the flood in Greek mythology. So it's really interesting because a lot of these Greek myths that come to us, I also didn't know Prometheus was involved in the Pandora story. We often hear these as standalones, and especially if we're reading something like Ovid's Metamorphoses, they're like little standalone vignette stories, and it's overwhelming and it's exciting. And both Deb and I, in researching for tonight's happy hour, we're both like, y'all better take our mythology degrees away.
We did not know this. I didn't.
I mean, and I even teach a section on flood myths in my mythology classes, but
so do I.
we look at the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yes.
And the Epic of Gilgamesh is arguably the first piece of literature in the world. And when we say that, I don't mean it's like the first story ever told, but it's the oldest story we've found that it was written down and preserved.
That's correct.
And even the beginning of the story is like, if you go to the town of Uruk and look in the temple, inside the temple, there's a cedar chest, and inside the cedar chest, there are scrolls. Take out the scrolls, and what do you find? Like, it's like instructions to find the text, but you got to find the text first to read the instructions. But it's the oldest story that we have record of. Mm-hmm. So, and Elizabeth Lesser brings this up in her book too. How many stories and how many cultural norms and ways of belief and ways of life were lost to prehistory? Because we tend to have this idea that prehistoric people means cave people. Yes. That like weren't modern humans. And that's absolutely not the case. And prehistory isn't a specific point in time. You can't say like, oh, writing was developed in 900 BCE, which I'm making that up. I don't know when writing was developed. Yeah. So everything before that's prehistory and everything after that's historical. Yeah. And that's
we tend to do that with all time periods, right? We, especially in history classes, we're like, okay, this is the modern period, this is the postmodern period, this is the Renaissance period. It's not like you woke up on Tuesday at 4 a.m.
Fit in neat, tiny little boxes. But life is more complicated than that. History and prehistory is much more complicated than that. Mm-hmm. Because my favorite example to use is the culture on Easter Island or Rapa Nui. Mm-hmm. They didn't develop writing until the 1800s because they had no need for it in their culture. So that doesn't say anything about their technological advancement or how advanced their society was or their culture. All it says is they didn't need to write things down because they had a smaller community and oral transmission, and that served them well. Mm-hmm. But the 1800s in Europe or the Americas were totally different. And so we have this like Eurocentric view of things that prehistory is before Europeans developed writing and history is after. So that was a long side tangent about.
Well, I think honestly, we could argue that writing things down made it worse, because then the stories were fixated and unable to change and grow and breathe with the societies they're supposed to represent, right? Which is where we get all this literalism. Mm-hmm. and separating the stories into little vignettes when really they should be told. Like, we had a professor that always said, you can't tell one Greek myth without telling them all. And that's true to a huge degree because they're so intertwined.
Absolutely. And it's just so interesting to think about it. Interesting is just such a cop-out word in academia, right? That's what you say when you don't know what to say.
Interesting. Yes.
You bring up an interesting point. I'll do more research on that later.
I just finished.
I have no idea what the hell you're talking about, and I can't answer your question.
That's pretty much what it means. I just finished John Green's new book, reviewing the Anthropocene review. I forget exactly what the title is. But he said when he was in 5th grade, he wrote an essay, and it had to be handwritten, and it had to be like 4 pages or something. And his handwriting was so terrible that the word interesting took up one whole line. So like every other sentence, he was like, this is interesting. Every time he could insert interesting, he did. So now forever in my life, anytime I hear an academic go interesting, I'm going to picture 5th grade John Green trying to make his word count or page count.
Okay, so Anne brought up a really great question. Aren't Native American elders trying to write down their language for their young? Yes. So this is a separate issue. So this is about preservation and transmission of culture, because in the Americas, Native American tribes were, as we know, forced on reservations, forced to speak English, dress like the English did. And
my grandma.
Yeah, and they were not allowed to speak their native language. And so there are programs now trying to re-enculturate
something. The Cherokee Nation has online classes that anyone can take, which is, I would love to learn that. my great-grandmother was forced back on a reservation. She married a Frenchman and they homesteaded. And then when he died, because one, Native Americans weren't allowed to homestead, and two, women weren't allowed to own property, they put her on a reservation, and my grandmother went with her, of course, as her child. And my grandmother lost her language. By the time I was born, all she really remembered was parts of the alphabet. And she had this really cool print of the Cherokee alphabet. It was up in her guest bedroom. And I wanted it so badly. And I did get a print of it, but it wasn't the original that she had. And I was so sad, but it's just lost. My great grandmother, she did eventually get her land back, and she refused to acknowledge any of that. As a matter of fact, she had a bonfire and burned everything, all the records. My grandma didn't even have a birth certificate, and it was just ugly. So yeah, that is a preservation of culture, not a solidifying of story. Teaching a language is not the same as writing down a story.
And I know part of this project is writing down myths and stories,
Sure,
both in native languages and in English, but that's because this was something that had to happen in secret. So if you were teaching your children, if Native Americans were teaching their children the language and the stories and the religion that they weren't allowed to practice, it had to be done behind closed doors, often under the cover of night. And so this is, in anthropology, there's a wonderful branch of anthropology called linguistic anthropology. And one of the biggest arguments of that branch is that our language shapes our worldview. And I feel like we've touched on this a little bit in our happy hour series, but we learn how to see the world by the language we use to describe it, because that's the only language that we can think in. And so the famous anthropological example that I hate bringing up because it's not true, but it's a very easy way to illustrate it, is that the Inuits have 36 words for snow. They need all of those different words because snow isn't just snow to people who live in the snow, right? And I can't even describe it because I grew up in LA and now I live in San Diego. But there's like crunchy snow, and there's soft powder snow, and there's icy snow that's dangerous. And like, there are so many different ways, and there are different ways that the snow comes down. And I don't have the language to describe those things because I don't need it. That's not ever something that has been a part of my life. And so we also have shared symbols in our language that when we speak, we're able to understand each other's jokes. But language is symbolic, right?
Well, think about when the Germanic English language met the Romantic French language, right? When their kingdoms combined, right? When they shared leaders for a while, and eating cow became beef, right? Or boeuf, right? Whatever, and chicken became poultry,
right? And so that's why we have so many doubles in the English language. And I love doing this lesson in my classes. The reason that we call it beef on the plate and cow in the field, because cow is the Germanic English and beef is the French, because the English were working the fields and the French were being served on their plates. Like that was their class status.
And the Germanic language is very useful, right? I think Eddie Izzard does a whole thing on why Latin went out, because it's like took them 4 days to tell them that the guys on the elephants were coming over the hill. Couldn't figure out the Latin to tell them. If they had English, they would have been like, dude, danger, let's go. And then it would have been a different story. So yeah.
So yeah, we've got chicken and poultry, we've got beef and cow. We've got pig and pork. We've got mutton.
Mutton and lamb, yeah. There's a really funny clip that I used to show in my class that was like an English family, like labor family trying, and then the wife is trying to be fancy with her new French words and ticking the husband off. It's great. I'll send it to you if I can find it.
Okay. But yeah, so language preservation is a little bit different when we're talking about colonialism. And the idea is that once these elders die off, their language is gone, So their worldview is gone, their customs are gone, their mythology is gone, their way of life is gone because it was stifled for so many years here in the Americas. And so the elders writing down their language is a part of that preservation and trying to reinvigorate Native American communities with and bring them back in touch with
But
the
honestly, too, though, who's to say that in 100 or 200 years those stories won't be literalized and turned into something that we've done with our stories? So, I mean, right now it's being done for another reason, but once there's distance from those original connotations, who knows what'll happen? And it will pose equal dangers.
right. And I mean, I feel like we've touched on this a little bit, but in when the Hebrew Bible got written down was when the Hebrews were displaced from their homeland, right? And so it created a diaspora, which is where people are forcibly displaced from their homeland and scattered about. And so when that happened, they got together before they scattered, supposedly, they got together before they got scattered about. They wrote down their stories and said, okay, like, this is the way our stories are told. This is the way we're going to pass them down. But that created stagnation because they were written down by specific people at a specific time to serve a specific purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And those are no longer the people reading and telling the stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way I just retold Pandora, bringing it to a modern era in modern language that we can understand and using some shared jokes that we all understand collectively and symbolically because we speak the same language, we live in the same country, and we are living at the same moment in time, most importantly. My favorite illustration for this is The Wizard of Oz. If you've ever heard of The Wizard of Oz, right? By Frank Baum. It's not just a fanciful children's tale. The characters in there were modeled after politicians of his day and were caricatures of these politicians. And he was writing like a scathing satire and political commentary on the banking system.
Sure.
Dorothy's slippers were silver, and she was using the silver to walk on the golden bricks and walk over them to get to the city of Oz, where everything was green, but it wasn't actually green because our green money was not backed by anything substantial. It was an illusion. It was symbolic. What happens when you get to the gates of the Emerald City? Green glasses are fastened to your head and tied with a key so you cannot take them off. So then when you enter through the walls, everything looks green. You necessarily need to know about the commentary of the banking system and the politicians that L. Frank Baum was referring to. No, the story stands alone and it's fine on its own. But once you learn those things and you dive a little deeper into it, you realize how much more rich and nuanced the story is. So when we're talking about these myths, we're missing so much context. Literally lost in translation, like the translation error from jar to box. So these are things we're never going to get back. We are never going to know these things, but we can take the fragments of the stories we do know, retell them in a way that serves our agenda, serves our purpose.
And I think it'd be an interesting commentary to look at why or when the focus shifted from making Pandora with the gods to when she opened the box. Like, why did we get so obsessed with the box? What was happening in society? And my guess is the Renaissance. And you know, maybe that idea of discovering and that whole, like you were talking about, the red button, right? As society progressed and things become safer, we feel we can take more risks if we're feeling like we can survive with, you know, our, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And so that shift in society, those values change, and then different parts of the stories become more important to us. I don't know if you've ever read books over and over, or you read books. I know, hello, who am I talking to? But but you know, you read a book and certain things stand out to you when you're younger, and then you read it again and you're like, oh shit, I missed that whole thing. Like, what was I thinking? And that, I read books with my classes every year, and every year I see something different in a book.
Yeah. And this is where this great, like, I guess it's like a sociological and a psychological concept of schema comes up,
Yes.
right? Every time we learn something or have an experience, I was taught that our schema is like a fishing net. And I just love this image of it. And when we're young, the holes in our fishing net are huge because we have like one strand each. And so we only catch the very biggest fish. We only understand the most basic things. But every time we learn or are reprimanded or whatever, we add another strand to our fishing net and we start being able to catch smaller and smaller fish. So when we go back to revisit a text, whether it's a book or a movie or whatever, we're coming to it with a different, new and improved schema. And now all of a sudden we're catching all these little fish that we weren't even aware were there before.
I love that. That's such a great way to look at it.
I think it's so beautiful because it doesn't mean that those things weren't there. It only means that we didn't have the capacity to understand them when we saw them. Yeah. And I think of that all the time. Like it's like the idea that once you notice a car on the road, then you start seeing it everywhere where you never saw it before. And
or if you're pregnant, then you see pregnant women everywhere. Yeah.
And so it's a little bit of like you find what you're looking for type thing, but before you know this, you can't look for them.
She says that. She says, show me what you notice and I'll tell you who you are. That, like, I had to sit with that for a minute. Yeah, that's a little humbling, right?
But what we need to remember too is that we don't necessarily have control of our schemas. We might not even know what threads make up our fishing net.
Is that why we need critical thinking skills? I don't know.
Maybe. Critical thinking skills are really important. I agree. And I think, yeah, building critical thinking skills adds different, I like that. I'm going to refer to it as like a spider web from now on, not a fishing net. Weaving different pieces,
yes.
weaving different web to be able to catch that. But we need critical thinking, of course,
to help us become aware of the web.
Right. But that's the thing, like we have to become aware of our web because only then can we start piecing it out strand by strand and saying, where did this come from? Does it serve me or not?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think of stories like Pandora, like so many comments have said, I had no idea Zeus was involved. I didn't know it was his fault. I didn't know this. We learn things from the TV we watch, from what our parents tell us, from offhand remarks from strangers when we're kids that somehow become a foundational part of how we interpret and see the world, that add a permanent strand to our schema, to this web in which we catch information, and tells us how to process it and how to interpret it. And if we are unaware that that web exists, we can't examine where these strands come from. We can't break it down and we can't change it. And that's the most important thing, right? We have to be aware of it.
It's like the movie Idiocracy, right? That movie, it's a totally average guy, like goes to sleep for like 500 years. And when he wakes up, he's like the smartest guy on earth. Right. And just these people are just being led around by the nose with the propaganda, and these machines are telling them what to do. And just because they're completely victim to whatever ad is playing, right? Because they have no critical thinking skills. They have no way of figuring things out for themselves. So they're just like existing.
Right.
And I usually try to tell my students that too. Is like, do you want to be manipulated by commercials and news shows all day long? Or would you rather, be able to look at it and discern what's really going on? And it's the same thing with the myths. We have to do it.
Let's look at it on the surface. Pandora's bad. Pandora's evil. She's responsible. Blame. She's to blame for the nature of women she's to blame for the downfall of humanity, just like Eve, right?
Mhm. And Adam standing around going, what? I didn't do anything. Epimetheus is like, what?
The snake, and she like told me to eat the fruit, and so like I did, but like it's not my fault.
Not my fault. Yeah. It's not my fault she wore that to the party. Yeah. So there it is.
There it is. There it is. So, I mean, and I don't know where I read this or heard this, but I love the idea that your knee-jerk response is how you've been taught to think. And second thought is what you actually think.
Yep.
And
that was
true. That was you that told me that?
Yeah. It was me.
Because I have this thought all the time. Like, I see a girl walking in a short skirt and sky high heels and a little, whatever, crop top. And my first thought is like, oh, what a slut. Or can't believe she's wearing that. Or, like
what we were taught to think as kids.
And I stop and I'm like, holy shit, where did that come from? Girl can do what she wants. And I mean, we all have intrusive thoughts. We all have these knee-jerk reactions that are oftentimes embarrassing or doesn't jive with who we are, who we think that we are.
Yes.
And the truth is that our culture has an effect on who we are and the way that we think, whether it's intentional, like advertisements or propaganda, or whether it's just our culture, what we picked up from reading between the lines. Nobody has to tell us. Okay, it's like the difference between like a fable and I'm mixing up my types of stories. Like an allegory and a fable. An allegory tells the story in symbolic language and figure it out. But a fable, like the tortoise and the hare, it gives you the lesson at the end of it. Slow and wins the race. Right? Or grapes were sour anyways. Or beware of a wolf in sheep's clothing. That's like the propaganda, and these cultural lessons are more absorbed from reading between the lines, like allegories. We see how people treat each other in relationship. And this is why like childhood trauma is so foundational to who we turn out to be as adults. If you grow up in an environment where the response to anger is to hit, that's what you learn is appropriate. And nobody has to tell you that. You see it happening. And that becomes part of your schema, and then you have to work to stop that.
But then when you develop the tools, your first reaction may still be to hit, but now oh, I can recognize that reaction is something that was ingrained in me. I realize that's wrong now. Of course, this all takes place in a matter of seconds, right? Maybe a little bit longer. And then you say, okay, so I really want to react this way. And that's what you choose to do. But that's who you are, because that's how you chose to act. You didn't react, right?
Right. And shout out to therapy, because that's where you have the opportunity to break down a lot of this stuff and to break down a lot of your knee-jerk reactions and really figure out, how do I want to react in this situation? And it's our schema. I mean, our schemas are everything, man. And that's why everybody thinks and views the world so differently, because we all have these webs built of different threads, because we've all had different experiences growing up. And this is why there are so many different versions of the same myths, because different people are telling them and different people are receiving them at different moments in time. Wouldn't it be interesting if my retelling of Pandora popped up in some digital archaeological expedition in 1,000 years, and
it's possible.
It's one of the oldest versions that we could find, that's how archaeology works.
If my house ends up being like a dig someday, they're going to think we had like magic wands and Harry Potter was like this great god. And I mean, can you imagine what they're gonna think? So
Yep.
yeah. So
Well, this has been wonderful as always. Do you
it was
have
fun.
any additional thoughts? Oh, I had one additional thought when I was reading about the jar having a voice, because I also got the impression that like it could move and like change its hiding spot in some of the, and I was like real creeped out because I was also listening to a retelling, and I was on a walk last night at like 10:30 p.m. and I was like, I'm gonna go for a walk while I listen to this. And then it would be like, and Pandora crept up to the attic and she heard a whisper and she looked. Was it the jar? And I'm like, oh God, like it's in my AirPod and I'm walking and everything's creepy and it's at night and the jar is whispering and maybe it's
Book it
moving.
at
And
home.
oh,
No. Back. Nope. Mm-mm.
this moment that I'm in receiving this story, now it's reading like a horror story to me. And I couldn't help but wonder, was Pandora schizophrenic? Is this like an early story about how the mental health system fails the people that it needs to serve?
I mean, you could take it that way, depending on the edition you're listening to.
Yep. Yep. So I thought that was interesting. I also thought I'm going over my notes here that we didn't address.
I will say too that jar is not very sturdy. If you've ever looked at the way Greek jars are built, they're not super sturdy on the bottom.
Oh, that he destroyed like a whole jar store.
Yeah. I'm just saying, like, it was meant to be broken open. It was going to happen, regardless of whether she chose to do it or not. Say it again.
Rules were made to be broken.
Jars were made to be broken.
Zeus exists to be disobeyed.
Mm-hmm.
Y'all, I am not a Zeus fan. We're gonna have a night where we just like rip on Zeus because I got a lot of things to say.
I'll just say, if it wasn't for Zeus, I wouldn't have a dissertation.
Yeah. I also was thinking, let's see, the wedding vows have Pandora agreeing to be subservient and have Epimetheus promise not to let her out of hand as women are wont to do. A lot like our.
Isn't that strange? As women are wont to do when she's the first woman. Huh. Okay, Hesiod, I see you.
And this specific retelling also described Pandora as young of body and mind, which gave even more creepy pedophilia vibes. So, and I also had a question. How did Pandora not know about the trick? Was it just because she was not given life while they were talking about it? Because my idea is that these gods and goddesses, they're like making her and giving her gifts and doing all this stuff and also talking about their plan the whole time, like evil Bond villains, but she just doesn't. Is she not alive yet? Is she not alive until she's like delivered to his Epimetheus's doorstep?
Well, Hephaestus breathes life into her. Like there's even a parallel there to Genesis, right? He breathes the life into her. So I don't know.
So yeah, or perhaps she was just so young of body and mind that her schema was underdeveloped to have any understanding of what she was doing, because that was her whole purpose for creation. So then you have to wonder, if she was the first woman, then why were women continuously created after? It's the nature of all women. And I guess we'll leave you all with that burning unanswerable question.
Next week we get to the star of the show,
Cassandra.
I'm so excited. If you get a chance, I know that we're working on this book, but Natalie Haynes wrote 1,000 Ships, which is a fictional, obviously, retelling of the Iliad through the women's point of view. And Cassandra's story is woven in so beautifully, and her point of view, it's haunting. And I'll probably listen to it again this week just to pull some of that mood out as I research Cassandra. But Also, so I don't know, that's something that if people want to go a little bit deeper into Cassandra's mind and what she probably went through, that would be a good one too.
Absolutely. And I will, in the notes for the replay of this video, I will link that book. I'll link Cassandra Speaks again. And shout out to Anne. You have a thank you note coming your way for your wonderfully gracious donation to us last week. Another reminder to everybody, we are a nonprofit run by a very small group of passionate volunteers like myself and Deb. And if you appreciate what you're learning and you find value in it, please feel free to donate to our cause. You can go to fernwaycollective.org and click on the donate tab. You could donate here through our Facebook page or Venmo. We are at Fernway Collective Inc., I believe. And oh no, just at Fernway Collective. Or our PayPal's Fernway Collective Inc. So yeah, at Fernway Collective on Venmo. You can find us on PayPal. You can find us all over the place. And your donation is tax deductible. We will provide you with a receipt. We are a 501c3 nonprofit corporation here in the US. We're also registered as a California nonprofit in the state of California. We have some more fun virtual events coming up. Like Deb mentioned, next week we are getting into the story of Cassandra. Let us know if you have any ideas of things that you would like us to research and talk about. I really want to do one on Medusa. I feel like she fits really well in the series that we're doing. And I'm very passionate about retelling the story of Medusa.
Ooh, Ariadne would be a good one too.
Yes, and Isis, another fave of mine, or Io turning into Isis. Anyways, let us know what you're interested in hearing about. We are always happy to do additional research and have fun conversations and learn new things ourselves, right? The learning never ends. And yeah, super fun. Super fun. We do this stuff because we love it, because we're passionate about it, and because we know there's a lot of misinformation out there, and it's exciting for us to be able to engage in these conversations and share with all of you. So if you're interested in learning more about our mission or about our in-person programming that's coming up, you can head to fernwaycollective.org. We've got a trip scheduled to New Orleans in the fall to discover Halloween in New Orleans, my favorite city. And then next summer, we are going to Iceland for 2 weeks. All the details for those trips are at fernwaycollective.org. We still have spots available on both of those trips. They're very small groups, limited space. New Orleans is 10 people, Iceland is 15 people. So yeah, check us out. Gotta plug all our things. Thank you to everybody for joining. Huge thanks again to Deb for being here and doing the research and being incredible. And Deb, unless you have anything
else to you
add, you're welcome.
No, I think I'm good. I need to go rest my introvert self.
All right. Well, thank you. We will see you all next week to discuss Cassandra. And if you, again, have any requests, any comments, any feedback, please let us know. And we are looking forward to seeing you all next week. Adios.